Do you like Jim Shooter? A lot of people online do, and lately, I'd say really over the last 2 years, his name has gotten more and more prominence as being the guy who knew what to do with comics and kind of a sign of where comics lost their way and where problems occurred. Now, some of this is hyperbole, some of it is opinion, and there's a lot about Jim Shooter that I think is a little bit misunderstood. So I wanted to kind of lay out some of the things that he did where people consider him good, bad, and then you can make up your own mind how impactful he was. And I think along with that, maybe separating out a little of the fiction because there is a lot of fiction where Jim Shooter is concerned, and which is true of everybody in comics. But let's get into it. Hey everybody, this is Perch. One of the things that I note kind of with some a wry smile, I would say is the thing, is that Jim Shooter's name comes up all the time. And when I do live streams and chats and I'm with other people often bring up Jim Shooter as like it wasn't like this under Jim Shooter's day. And ever since Jim Shooter left, that's when things started to go downhill. But what's also apparent is a lot of people who are saying this, they don't really kind of understand Jim Shooter's time at Marvel, kind of what he did and when he did it, and kind of are they're assigning both blame because you can go in some corners of the internet, by the way, and find people that absolutely hate Jim Shooter with a passion, and they'll tell you all the reasons he's wrong. And you find other places where it's like, well, Jim Shooter ran a tight army-like ship and wouldn't let any shenanigans or malarkey go on, and that's when comics was the best. And the reality is both those things are not exactly true. So Jim Shooter, I mean, first off, he worked for Marvel. He then went to Valiant, which he founded. He was fired from Marvel, and kind of it wasn't really a fire. I mean, again, it depends on your terms, but basically the people who put the money in wanted to sell Valiant, and Jim Shooter didn't. And when you're using somebody else's money to form a venture, that puts you at odds with kind of what the what the bankroll people have, and that's where that happened. But very different reasons. Him being removed from Marvel was completely different than why his tenure ended at Valiant. And some people mix those two up. They always kind of say, well, he comes in, he runs a tight ship and doesn't let anybody kind of screw around, and thinks about the customer first and all this kind of stuff. But they're not the same. The things that went on at Marvel were very different from the things that went on Valiant. They were not one and the same. Jim Shooter, he what you can credit him for, I think, very accurately, is that he definitely popularized the miniseries in a positive way while he was at Marvel. This idea of kind of it's weird to call them event comics because that means such a different thing now. But he popularized this idea of kind of miniseries and how to properly, from a business perspective, assess, what was going to be an ongoing, what was going to be bi-monthly, what was going to be limited, short term. And he was very much, I don't know about opposed, but he ran his ship in such a way that there was a definite system for how you rolled out comics. I think, a lot of people have a lot of different things to say about him, but I think you can give him a lot of the credit, and not the sole credit, but the vast majority of the credit for kind of how miniseries and how some of these comics were intended and planned. I will say, in the context of today, that particular skill would go a really long way in terms of defining, what is the comic line, what are we going to commit to as an ongoing, what's going to be a miniseries. That is something that's hurting today, and that's one of the reasons why I think people look more up to him today, is because he had that product portfolio management, for lack of a better word, that really was a strength of his. As an editor and then an editor-in-chief, I think he had an intent. Now, this can be a harder thing to explain, but whether you liked his direction or you didn't like his direction, we'll get into what some of those were in a minute. He had a plan. It never felt like it was an aimless ship. Now, but another way to describe this might be that he would wake up in the morning, he would have a business plan, and we try and execute that business plan. Other editors-in-chief see their job more as a kind of a corralling, or my job is just to kind of mainly keep the car on the road, but the direction we're going can be whatever it needs to be. Jim Shooter kept the car on the road, but also had a destination in mind. Sometimes that was a good thing, and sometimes it was bad. I mean, he pushed Dazzler and that whole kind of comic plus movie plus music scheme pretty hard, and it did not. That was a bad plan. That was not a a plan and a destination that was going anywhere good. But he did commit to the bit. He committed to doing it, and in many cases suffer the consequences. I think some of the storytelling that's gone about him being like, wouldn't put up with any kind of shenanigans or anything in the office. I think that's been exaggerated to a pretty large extent, partly by Shooter himself. If you talk to him, in some of his classes and things that he's done in recent years, he portrays himself as being a lot more of a, not taskmaster, but we're not going to put up with any kind of crazy nonsense. And if you actually go to the time period, you'll see plenty of crazy nonsense. I mean, there certainly was silliness. You'd see John Byrne, Mark Waid, others would do kind of goofy things. And John Byrne in particular, he was. I'm saying what I'm saying about Mark Waid. Sorry. Forget Mark Waid for a minute. John Byrne. Mark Waid comes in a minute. But John Byrne was definitely doing things, and John Byrne was, semi out of control at times. Now, again, I'm a big fan of John Byrne, but, definitely one of the top 5 comic creators in my mind. But, I mean, Byrne was given a long leash. And I think as a positive, Jim Shooter would trust creators like Chris Claremont, John Byrne, some others. He'd give them a very long rope. He did that because they were, in theory, trustworthy. But he at the same time, Chris Claremont was a fairly buttoned up guy, but Shooter also was pretty merciless, I would say, with egos of talent that just weren't there yet. And this is either good or bad, depending on what you think of some of those people at the time. But Byrne, when Shooter left, I mean, Byrne kind of went on a rampage and blew up Shooter's hometown and other things. So to say that like Shooter kept things really tight and under control is not accurate at all. That's definitely looking through the world through rose-colored glasses. He did assert some control, but not anywhere to the point that I know some of the bigger videos. I think the Diversity in Comics guy has made videos on Shooter and has portrayed him as a very kind of buttoned up bullpen at the time, and that was not the case. There was definitely, plenty of hijinks, some by Shooter himself, but they were different. I think Shooter also did have ideas. This goes back to the plan around what should happen. So, Jim Shooter was very much rigid about the death should mean death, and if you're going to go through that process of killing a character off, you need to make it stick. You need to make it impactful. Can't be just a shenanigan. Jean Grey, Shooter was kind of in favor of having a lot of that stuff go down, but then Shooter also was there when Jean Grey was brought back to life. So he did flip-flop on some of his positions. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. In many cases, this was an area where, I think, Shooter was a money guy. And this gets to where some of the complaints come in. And usually the complaints against Shooter come into 3 camps. The first one is that he stifled creative control because he was too, he had too much of a chokehold on what people could do. And like I mentioned earlier, I don't think that's terribly accurate. I don't think he had as much of a chokehold on things as people believed. I do think he was an editor-in-chief who had, like I said, a plan. He had an intent for where comics should go and what should do. And Shooter was definitely business-minded. And this kind of gets into the second complaint, is that at times a Shooter forced things from a business perspective that maybe weren't the best things to force. Like the whole Dazzler event, which there's a whole video on what went on there that you can look back in my archives. Search for Perch and Dazzler, you'll find it. But there were things that he did which were designed to kind of maximize profits that were not good ideas. And if you had taken a bit of a step back, it did create at times a more comics has to find a balance between telling big, creative, memorable stories and also trying to make money. You've got to do both things. And at times, Shooter dipped too much into the let's make money, and that caused certain endeavors to just not really go the way they should have gone. And suffer as a result. I think there was money left on the table because of some of these things. The third one is really depending on your point of view, and this seems to be the lightning rod for for a lot of people, and it is simply this question: did you like Secret Wars or not? And when I say Secret Wars, I mean the original, the one from the '80s. Some people really, it really some people really hate that event because it was intended to sell some toys, which it did. It was something different for Marvel at the time, kind of the big event, big crossover. A lot of people complained it was a ripoff of Crisis, and it was like it was Crisis Light, Crisis for kids. Some people said it diminished a lot of the characterization. So there's a lot of if you like that event, you probably are fond of Shooter. If you hated that event, you probably blame Shooter. And so it really kind of comes down to what you believe. I think the Secret Wars was a positive for the company. It did good things. It did show that there was a merchandise comic tie-in, something that then people kind of failed to capitalize on much in the years to follow. All things considered, did Jim Shooter alienate a lot of talent? Yeah, he absolutely did. There, as I mentioned before, John Byrne, from a legendary perspective, hated him, but there were others that really had a problem with Shooter and his behavior, and there's some good talent in there that was part of that process. If you talk to a lot of artists kind of that were around in that run, I would say more say negative things about Shooter than positive. And a lot of these artists are really solid, good people. So great talent did leave Marvel during Shooter's run. And that was a big deal. That was not good. At the same time, there was, Shooter did bring in talent. So Shooter did have a bit of the reputation of attracting talent. Some of that could be argued that it was because Shooter was showing that money could be made, and so it was a place that it was a place that really it showed people that you can make money in comics. And I think for a lot of people who grew up collecting comics in the '80s, it helped create that romance around what comics were. I think all things told, I think Stan Lee ran an editorial direction that was in his mind. I think Jim Shooter was probably the next person who really had a vision. And in terms of Marvel in general, those are probably the only two really big names that had a firm plan when it comes to editorial. Everyone else has handled the job a little differently, and that's where you get people who either love or hate Jim Shooter because they either like that plan, believed it was right for it to sit with the editor in chief, or don't like that plan and believed it should sit with the creators. And I think how you come down on that issue really probably says a lot about whether you ultimately like Shooter or not. When Shooter left, it left Marvel in a weird place on two fronts. It definitely, it had isolated some talent away from Marvel who did not, immediately come back, or in some cases ever come back. And it left some people who were loyal to Shooter or confused, or like Byrne hated him and immediately burned an effigy of him. So it left Marvel in a very strange state that kind of created the vacuum that brought a lot of the image creators, the people like the Liefelds and Lees and others. Part of the reason they flourished as powerful artists is because Shooter left. It left a vacuum in terms of editorial and writing, and allowed the pendulum to swing a bit toward art. So for a lot of people who really love the '90s and love the Jim Lees and Liefeld, Silvestris, Todd McFarlane's, etc., it's at least possible that that whole environment, that whole their rise to success might not have happened, or wouldn't have happened in the same way if Shooter had stayed. So Shooter leaving actually probably did create a little bit of this vacuum that brought talent in. It was I think that when Shooter was really going, you have Mark Wolfman, you had George Perez, Gene Colan, Roy Thomas, Frank Miller, Doug Monek. There's a few others that left and were very kind of outspoken, didn't like Shooter. Now, a lot of those names I just mentioned are not like crazy people. Like when some people say, Jim Shooter is great and he drove all the nuts out, you don't necessarily think like Marv Wolfman, George Perez, Gene Colan. Those aren't the names that spring to mind as being nuts. Those people are pretty strong talent. So I think there's a mismatch a little bit in what Shooter did and didn't do. So there's it was a lot. at the end of the day, this is the way I come down to it. I think that the editor-in-chief role should have somebody who wants the job and has a plan and fearlessly executes that plan. I think that that kind of structure is valuable and needed if you're at the big two. I think Jim Shooter did that. So in that sense, I think it was positive. I think that in some ways, Shooter was overbearing, and I think sometimes he, didn't get advice to tweak his plan. That's why some of his things went really sideways, is because he tended to, have his own opinion, have his own way of doing things, and wasn't particularly interested in other people coming in to influence his vision or help shape it. And I think it's very hard in any job, in any profession, to have one person who sets the vision for everybody, and that's just it. That's a very hard standard for anyone to live up to, and that's why you typically need a team. Now, at the same time, if you have too much of a team, then it just becomes like nobody's in charge, and that's kind of what it feels like at Marvel today, at least. That it's kind of all over the place. I think that Jim Shooter did put some things in place around kind of a level between upper management and the workers that is still in place today. It's interesting that the legacy of what Shooter did in terms of a management structure is definitely still in place at Marvel. The difference is that whereas I think Shooter's was driving for business, and money talked, and there was a desire to kind of get bigger and bigger and bigger. That's what he did. A lot of the people who have come in after him have kind of maintained the power structure, but not the business side. So it's more for politics and for cash. Now, again, this gets to your point of view of, did you believe that the 80s were filled with, unrepentant greed and terrible, money grabbing? Or did you believe that it made a lot of people rich and therefore good? I think where you come down on that scale also probably says a lot about how you feel about Shooter and some of these things. I think making money is good. And I think that, as long as it's legal, as long as you're not destroying people in the process of making that money, I think you should shoot for, big business and trying to build things. And in that respect, I think I like a lot of what Jim Shooter brought to the table. I do think his treatment of folks was often goofy. I think some of the micromanagement was at times petty. I think that absolutely was true, especially some of the stories like George Perez and Frank Miller have said over time of just wanting to manage things for the sake of managing. I think that's negative. But in general, the Shooter is funny, and it's weird how Shooter has become a new kind of benchmark against where people fall in comics. I don't think he's the saint of all comics, the hero, the savior. I don't think he's the villain and the worst Scourge. What is it? I don't remember. At some point, some con, he was dubbed the Scourge of Marvel Comics, and it was just it's a lot of kind of hyperbole. It's just funny how people are. But in general, I think there's positives about the guy. I think there's a lot of things he did that absolutely would benefit the big two today. In particular, just the structure and rules. It's definitely needed, and it's missing bad, big time. At the same time, I think that it's management. Man, management's tough, and a lot of people do it very, very poorly. And it's just a reality of kind of life and work and how things go. But what do you think? Shooter, hero of all comics or villain of all comics? Let me know in the comments below what you think. And I guess the other thing I would say here is that I've heard a number of videos on Shooter that other people have done, and they always throw kind of these little statements out, and it's kind of like the exaggerated tale. I've heard things recently, I would say in the last month or so, about Jim Shooter that are just, pardon the expression, but batshit crazy in terms of what he did. I mean, there's a lot of fiction out there. There's definitely some untrue things that have been said about Jim Shooter, and like anything else, life is rarely as dramatic as what is sometimes portrayed. But anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. Hey, like, subscribe, follow the channel if you don't mind. Shoot me an email or follow me on social media. And most importantly, thanks for listening.